Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
I've always loved the idea of having a deck in my backyard. It's not just about the extra space, it's about creating a little oasis where I can relax after a long day, maybe host a barbecue or two, and just enjoy the outdoors. So, when I finally saved up enough to make it happen, I was thrilled. I hired a landscaper, let's call him Greg, who came highly recommended. He was meticulous, professional, and assured me he'd follow every guideline to the letter. I figured, with his expertise and my vision, this would be a smooth process. Boy, was I wrong? The first step was submitting a request to the HOA for approval. Greg and I went over the city's regulations and the HOA's rules together. He double-checked everything, made sure the deck size was within the limits, and even drew up detailed plans that included measurements, materials, and a timeline. We submitted the application and waited. And waited. And waited. 60 days passed with no response. Not a peep. I started to wonder if maybe no news was good news. I'd heard rumors that some HOAs had a silence equals approval policy, so I decided to do a little digging. I posted in our neighborhood's Facebook group, asking if anyone had a copy of the bylaws. I figured it couldn't hurt to check. The responses were interesting. Some people chimed in with their own HOA horror stories, but no one seemed to have a copy of the CC&Rs. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions that govern our community. One neighbor, Belinda, said she'd been trying to get a copy for months with no luck. Another, Mike, joked that the HOA probably didn't want anyone to know the rules because then they couldn't enforce them arbitrarily. I laughed, but deep down, I was starting to get a bad feeling. Then, like clockwork, less than 24 hours after my Facebook post, I got an email from the HOA. The subject line was all caps, request denied. My heart sank as I opened it. The reason? Deck too big for our small backyards. That was it. No explanation, no reference to specific rules, just those 7 words. I forwarded the email to Greg, who was just as baffled as I was. He responded almost immediately with a detailed breakdown of the city's regulations and the HOA's own guidelines. According to both, our proposed deck was well within the allowed size. He even included screenshots of the relevant sections, just to make sure I understood. This doesn't make any sense, he said over the phone. They're not even following their own rules. Frustrated but determined, I decided to appeal the decision. I submitted a formal appeal, complete with Greg's documentation and a polite but firm letter explaining why I believed the decision was incorrect. I waited again, hoping this time would be different. But another 30 days went by with no response. Nothing, not even an acknowledgement that they'd received my appeal. By this point, I was starting to feel like I was banging my head against a wall. I reached out to the HOA again, this time requesting a copy of the bylaws directly. 2 weeks later, they finally sent them over. I pored over the document, looking for anything that might explain their decision. That's when I found it, a clause that made my stomach churn. It read, "No deemed or verbal approval. Approval by the architectural reviewer may not be deemed, construed, or implied from an action, a lack of action, or a verbal statement by the declarant, declarant's representative or designee or the association, an association director or officer, a member or chair of the declarant or board-appointed architectural control committee, the association's manager, or any other representative of the association. To be valid, approval of the architectural reviewer must be I. In writing, E. On a form or letterhead issued by the architectural reviewer, E. Signed and dated by a duly authorized representative of the architectural reviewer, designated for that purpose, IV. Specific to a unit, and V. Accompanied by detailed plans and specifications showing the proposed change. If the architectural reviewer fails to respond in writing, negatively, affirmatively, or requesting information, within 60 days after the architectural reviewer's actual receipt of the owner's application, the application is deemed denied. Under no circumstance may approval of the architectural reviewer be deemed, implied, or presumed. I read it twice, then a third time, just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. Essentially, the HOA could ignore requests, and after 60 days, the request would be automatically denied. No explanation, no recourse, just a flat-out no. I couldn't believe it. How was this even legal? I called Greg to vent, This is insane, I said. They're basically saying they can do whatever they want, and there's nothing we can do about it. Greg sighed. Unfortunately, HOAs have a lot of power. But that doesn't mean we're out of options. Have you thought about reaching out to a lawyer? Someone who specializes in HOA disputes might be able to help. I hadn't considered that, but it made sense. If the HOA wasn't going to play fair, maybe I needed to bring in someone who could level the playing field. I started researching lawyers in the area and found one who had experience dealing with HOAs. Her name was Lisa, and she came highly recommended. I scheduled a consultation and brought all my documentation. The HOA's denial email, Greg's plans, the city's regulations, and the HOA's bylaws. Lisa listened carefully as I explained the situation, nodding along as I spoke. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This is a tough one, but not impossible. The fact that they're not following their own guidelines works in your favor. We can argue that their decision was arbitrary and capricious, which is grounds for overturning it." "But what about that clause in the bylaws?" I asked. "The one that says they can just ignore requests and they're automatically denied?" Lisa smiled. "That clause might not hold up in court. There's a legal principle called good faith and fair dealing, which means that even if the bylaws give them a lot of leeway, they still have to act reasonably. Ignoring your request and then denying it without explanation doesn't sound reasonable to me." Hearing that gave me a glimmer of hope. Lisa agreed to take on my case, and we started preparing for what could be a long battle. In the meantime, I decided to rally some support from my neighbors. I posted in the Facebook group again, this time sharing my story and asking if anyone else had experienced similar issues with the HOA. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people commented, sharing their own frustrations. Some had been denied for seemingly arbitrary reasons, like the color of their front door or the type of plants in their garden. Others had been fined for minor infractions, like leaving their trash cans out an hour too long. It was clear that I wasn't the only one who felt like the HOA was overstepping. Belinda, the neighbor who'd been trying to get a copy of the bylaws, reached out to me privately. "I think we need to do something about this," she said. "If enough of us band together, maybe we can force the HOA to be more transparent and fair." I agreed. We started organizing a meeting, inviting anyone who was interested in discussing how to address the HOA's behavior. The turnout was better than I expected. About 20 people showed up, all with their own stories and grievances. We talked for hours, brainstorming ideas and strategies. By the end of the night, we'd formed a committee to advocate for change. Meanwhile, Lisa was making progress on the legal front. She sent a formal letter to the HOA, outlining our case and demanding that they reconsider their decision. She also requested a meeting with the HOA board to discuss the issue in person. To my surprise, they agreed. The meeting was tense. The board members sat on one side of the table, while Lisa, Greg, and I sat on the other. Lisa presented our case calmly and professionally, pointing out the inconsistencies in their decision and the lack of transparency in their process. The board members listened, but their expressions were unreadable. When Lisa finished, the board president, a man named Tom, leaned forward. "We understand your concerns," he said, "but we have to consider the community as a whole. We can't just approve every request that comes our way. We're not asking for special treatment," I interjected. "We're asking for fairness. If the rules say the deck is allowed, then it should be approved. It's that simple." Tom hesitated, then nodded. "We'll take your concerns under advisement and get back to you." It wasn't the victory I'd hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. A few weeks later, I received another email from the HOA. This time, the subject line was, "Request approved." I couldn't believe it. After months of fighting, they'd finally given in. I called Greg immediately. "We did it," I said. "They approved the deck." Greg laughed. "I knew we'd get there eventually. Let's get started." As construction began, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not just for the deck, but for standing up to the HOA and fighting for what was right. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but in the end, it was worth it. And as I sat on my new deck for the first time, watching the sunset, I knew that this was just the beginning. The committee we'd formed was already making progress, pushing for more transparency and accountability from the HOA. Change was coming, and I was proud to be a part of it. The part that gets me is how the HOA only sent the bylaws after you posted in the Facebook group. That's so shady. It's like they were hoping you'd just give up and go away. And then they have the nerve to deny your deck for being too big, when your landscaper proved it was within their own guidelines? That's not just unfair, it's lazy. They didn't even bother to come up with a legitimate reason. I'm glad you fought back, but it's ridiculous that you had to hire a lawyer just to get them to follow their own rules. What a waste of time and money. The fact that the HOA ignored your request for 60 days and then denied it with no explanation is bad enough, but the real kicker is that clause in the bylaws. How is it even legal for them to say, if we don't respond, it's automatically denied? That's such a blatant power move. It's like they're saying, we don't have to be fair or transparent because we make the rules. And then they only sent you the bylaws after you publicly asked for them. That's not just unprofessional. It's downright sneaky. I'm glad you got your deck in the end, but it's insane that you had to go through all that. HOAs like this thrive on making things difficult for homeowners, and it's exhausting to read about. What really stands out to me is how the HOA only acted when you started making noise. They ignored your request for 2 months, but the second you posted in the Facebook group asking for the bylaws, they magically found the time to send you a denial email. That's not a coincidence, it's a pattern. They only care when they're called out. And the reason they gave? Deck too big for our small backyards. That's not even a real reason. It's just a vague excuse they threw out because they couldn't be bothered to look at the guidelines. The fact that your landscaper had to send them proof that the deck was within the rules says it all. They weren't doing their job, plain and simple. I'm glad you didn't back down and got your deck approved, but it's frustrating that you had to go through all that. HOAs are supposed to make life easier, not harder, and this one failed miserably. If you like our stories, then please like and subscribe and comment, and remember to hit that bell icon so you never miss out. We have new stories almost every day. It's been a long road, but I'm finally closing in on the finish line. My apartment is officially under contract, and in less than 2 weeks, I'll be completely free of this place. I put it on the market back in April, and after months of showings, negotiations, and dealing with the co-op board, the buyers were approved last week. I can't tell you how relieved I am to be done with all of it. But honestly, the real relief isn't just about selling the apartment. It's about leaving behind the drama, the stress, and the neighbor from hell who made my life miserable for years. Let me rewind a bit. I moved into this apartment about 6 years ago. It's an older building, charming in its own way, with creaky floors and thick walls. Or so I thought. At first, everything seemed fine. I kept to myself, and my neighbors seemed nice enough. But then there was her, the board member who lives directly downstairs. Let's call her Mrs. Henderson, though I've called her plenty of other names in my head over the years. It started small, a knock on my door one evening, her standing there with a tight smile. "I can hear your footsteps," she said. "Could you try to walk more quietly?" I was taken aback but tried to be polite. "Sure, I'll keep it in mind," I told her. I even went out and bought thicker rugs, covering about 80% of the apartment. I thought that would be the end of it. Oh, how wrong I was. The complaints kept coming. Every little noise seemed to set her off. I'd get notes slipped under my door, emails from the board, even a few late-night knocks when I was just walking from the kitchen to the living room. I tried to explain that it's an old building, noise is part of the deal. But she wasn't having it. It felt like she was on a mission to make my life as difficult as possible. Things came to a head when my son was born. You'd think having a baby in the building would soften her heart, but no. If anything, it made her worse. She complained constantly about his crying, about the sound of his little feet as he learned to walk, even about the noise of his toys. One day, she cornered me in the hallway. "Your child is too loud," she said, her voice sharp. "You need to do something about it." I couldn't believe it. "He's a baby," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "What do you expect me to do? Keep him in a cage? He's learning to walk. He's going to make noise." She just glared at me and walked away. That was the moment I decided I'd had enough. I told her that from then on, any complaints should go through my attorney. I wasn't going to engage with her anymore. The board, to their credit, backed off after that. I think they realized how ridiculous it was to expect a 1-year-old to be silent. But Mrs. Henderson? She never let up. Every time I saw her, she'd give me this look, like I was the worst person in the world for daring to live my life in my own apartment. It got to the point where I dreaded coming home. I was constantly on edge, worried about every little noise, every step, every sound my son made. It was exhausting. Then, last year, my husband and I started talking about buying a house. We wanted more space, a backyard for our son to play in, and, honestly, a fresh start. We found the perfect place, a little fixer-upper just outside the city, and made an offer. When it was accepted, I felt like I could finally breathe again. We moved out last month, and let me tell you, it's been amazing. My mental health has improved so much. I don't feel that constant weight on my shoulders anymore. And my son, he's thriving. He can run around, laugh, play, and be a kid without me worrying about someone banging on the ceiling or leaving a nasty note. Now, with the closing just days away, I'm feeling a mix of emotions. Relief, mostly, but also a little bit of satisfaction. I've thought about leaving a note for Mrs. Henderson on the day of the closing. Nothing mean, just a little something to let her know that her reign of terror is over. Maybe something like, good luck to the new owners. I hope they're quieter than we were. Okay, maybe that's a little petty, but after everything she put me through, I think I've earned it. The other day, I ran into one of my old neighbors in the lobby. She was heading out with a reusable shopping bag slung over her shoulder, and when she saw me, she stopped and smiled. "So, you're really leaving us?" she asked, her tone light but curious. "I heard you bought a house." "That's exciting." "Yeah," I said, grinning back. "It's been a long time coming. We've been talking about moving for a while now, and everything finally fell into place. It feels like the right time. You know, I'm ready to move on and start fresh." She nodded, her smile widening. "I'm happy for you. A house sounds amazing. More space, no shared walls, no one breathing down your neck. It's going to be a big change, but a good one, I bet." "Definitely," I replied, feeling a sense of relief just talking about it. "It's been a journey, but I'm looking forward to the next chapter." "It's time." "I don't blame you," she said, lowering her voice. "Between you and me, I think everyone's ready for a break from Mrs. Henderson's drama. She's been complaining about the new people moving in, and they haven't even arrived yet." I laughed. Some things never change. As I walked out of the building that day, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. This chapter of my life is almost over, and I'm ready for the next one. The house is everything we hoped for, and more. My son has a yard to play in, and I don't have to worry about anyone complaining about the noise. It's freeing, in a way I didn't even realize I needed. Still, there's a part of me that wonders what Mrs. Henderson will do now that we're gone. Will she find someone else to harass? Or will she finally realize that living in an apartment building means dealing with a certain amount of noise? Either way, it's not my problem anymore. I've got my own life to focus on, and it's looking brighter every day. The day of the closing is almost here, and I'm counting down the hours. I've already packed up the last of my things, and the apartment is empty, waiting for its new owners. As I stand in the living room one last time, I can't help but feel a little nostalgic. This was my home for 6 years, after all. But then I think about all the stress, the complaints, the sleepless nights worrying about every little sound, and I know I'm making the right choice. Okay, so I think one minor act of revenge, jumping up and down as hard as I could several times, trying to be as loud as possible. I take a deep breath and walk out the door, locking it behind me. As I head down the stairs, I pass Mrs. Henderson's apartment. For a moment, I consider knocking on her door just to say goodbye. But then I think better of it. Some things are better left unsaid. Instead, I leave the building with my head held high, ready to start this new chapter of my life. And as I walk away, I can't help but smile. Good luck to the new owners. They're going to need it. A colleague of mine once said his dream was to own at least 2,560 acres in a single block. 2,560? Seems an awfully specific number. He then explained that that would mean he could live in the center of said square, and that there would be nobody within a mile of him. At least, sounds pretty damn good to me. This is why I'll never live in an HOA. The idea of some random person having the authority to dictate how you live in your own home is insane. The neighbor complaining about a baby is next level entitlement. Babies cry, kids play, that's life. If you can't handle living around other people, maybe you should be the one moving to a remote cabin in the woods. The writer handled it better than I would have. I'd have told that neighbor to take a hike a long time ago. HOAs attract the most miserable people, and this story is proof. HOAs are nothing but a glorified excuse for busybodies to micromanage other people's lives. This story is a prime example of how toxic they can be. A baby making noise? Seriously, that's what you're complaining about. It's not like the kid was throwing ragers at 2 a.m. It's a toddler learning to walk. The fact that the board even entertained her complaints at first is mind-blowing. And let's be real, the neighbor downstairs probably has nothing better to do than stir up drama. People like her thrive in HOAs because they get a sick sense of satisfaction from controlling others. I'm glad the writer got out and found a better place to live, but it's sad that they had to deal with that nonsense for so long. HOAs need to be held accountable for enabling this kind of behavior. They're supposed to maintain property values, not make people's lives miserable. Stories like this make me never want to live anywhere near an HOA ever again.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.